Thanks so much, John. And thank you, Terry, also for making this possible. Real pleasure to be here to give this webinar to RCAT. And as John said, I'm going to talk about getting to net zero emissions. This is really all about climate challenges and solutions. Quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you the perspective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on how to get to net zero, why it's so important. I'm going to talk about the 4 key strategies to achieve net zero emissions for carbon dioxide. As many of you know, there are 5 other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is 80% of the problem. That's what we're going to talk about today. Those 4 strategies are improving energy efficiency, electrification of everything we do, the generation of clean, carbon-free electricity, and finally, the job of carbon capture in several forms. And I'm going to zero in on 2 of these strategies where there are some dissenting views within the climate community about how to get to 100% clean electricity. We can talk about getting there all with renewables, and why there could be some serious obstacles to getting there. We may need other things too. And on carbon capture, again, I'm going to make the case that there's an imperative to develop this technology, but we'll also talk about and acknowledge the dissenting views. My bottom line to wind up with is that we have a lot of climate technologies to choose from out there, and there's a strong case for diversifying our portfolio, spreading our chips at the climate casino, and not just putting all of our chips on one path to preserving a safe climate. So let's jump in to the Ipcc. Many of you may be familiar with this report that came out in 2018 that showed how globally we could keep warming to 1.5 degrees. The new Ipcc series of reports began to come out in late 2021 with the State of the Science report called Work Group 1. And within the next couple of months, we will see Work Group 2 and Work Group 3 reports come out. The Work Group 3 report will have pathways again to 1.5 degrees. I don't expect them to change dramatically from what we saw in 2018. I was a reviewer on this last year, and I would not expect big changes. So what I'm going to present will maybe change a little bit in some of the details. Basic message is the same. What is that message? To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, the globe is going to have to get on a very steep path of emission reductions. This is one of the sort of flagship figures from the Ipcc report of 2018. On the left, we show the global total net CO2 emissions, currently about 40 billion tons per year. And the science tells us that to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to get on a very steep path over the next 30 years to get down to net zero emissions, where whatever emitting is just balanced by whatever we're taking out of the atmosphere. That steep curve is going to require transformations across all economic sectors: electricity production, buildings, transportation, industry, complete transformations across all. The other thing this slide illustrates is that we are likely to overshoot the safe concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we will overshoot then 1.5 degrees, but we can pull back. If we move beginning around mid-century to taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, so we're in a range of net negative emissions, we can reverse that warming and keep it at 1.5 degrees. So that whole negative area thing I'm going to come back to later in the presentation, but right now I'm going to focus on how do we get on these very steep declining scenarios. When we look at the Ipcc report and other credible modeling of how we could get on that steep downward path of emissions, we find 4 key strategies being very consistent across all the analysis and modeling. I mentioned Ipcc. You'll see the same kind of analysis in the International Energy Agency reports, International Renewable Energy Association, Princeton's Net Zero America report that came out last year, as well as credible consulting firms. This particular example is taken from modeling led by Jim Williams in San Francisco. So I want to start with this second strategy, this second set of bars. We can be much more energy efficient in everything we do. Over the next 30 years, we can cut the gigajoules per person of consumption in the US from over 200 down to less than 150. We can cut it by about a third by just having more efficient buildings, more efficient vehicles, and tightening up our use of energy in industry. The next big strategy is electrification. Taking every end use we can think of and trying to convert it from the direct burning of fossil fuels to the direct use of electricity. Right now in 2020, we use about 20% of our final energy use is the direct use of electricity, like light bulbs, washing machines, etc. But we know we can increase that a lot. We can convert our use in buildings to stop burning gas and diesel, fuel oil, diesel in vehicles, and substitute a lot of electric vehicles, electric buildings, industry applications, and even begin to take electricity and make what many refer to as electric fuels. That's making hydrogen, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen atoms, creating ammonia from that, and other synthetic fuel options. So we can take the direct use of electricity from 20 to near 60% over the next 30 years. The third big pathway, third big strategy is, if we're going to electrify the economy, we're going to need a lot more electricity, and we're going to have to wring all the carbon out of generating that electricity. Right now, we produce about 500 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour we generate. We can take that down to near zero over the next 30 years. We have lots of ways we can make electricity without CO2 emissions. We have solar, we have wind, we have geothermal, we're developing tidal power, we have nuclear plants, we have the ability to capture right up to near 100% of the emissions from burning natural gas or biomass. So there's a lot of options for creating clean, zero carbon electricity. The final fourth strategy is carbon capture. Right now, we are just in the nascent phase. This technology is not fully commercialized. So in 2020, we're really not capturing much of anything. But over the next 30 years, we can use this technology to capture emissions from power plants. We can use it to capture emissions from industrial sources, and we can literally capture carbon and remove it from the atmosphere and lower CO2 concentrations if we go to scale. So those are the four key things, and we know how to do this. Most of this stuff can be done with existing technologies, along with developing some technologies that are near commercial that we can that are definitely not pie in the sky. Just to give you a little more feel for what that might look like, this from the Jim Williams study also shows how we can electrify transportation and buildings. In the upper left here, we see light duty vehicles, your cars and your SUVs. As everyone knows, we are beginning to see the penetration of all electric vehicles on top of the hybrids and plug-in hybrids that have been inching upward in market penetration. By 2050, we can phase out nearly all of our gasoline and diesel burning light duty vehicles. We can do this with technology that's in reach. Medium and heavy duty trucks present a little different problem. We're beginning to see all electric delivery vans, medium duty vehicles. We can probably run some of our heavy duty vehicles, but we're probably going to have to develop hydrogen fuel cells for some of the really heavy duty freight trucks, and on a slightly slower time scale than our light duty vehicles. But we can get there almost phasing out carbon emissions from vehicles by 2050. An even more optimistic scenario on the building side, here we have space heating in residential buildings. We already use a lot of electric resistance heating and heat pumps to heat our homes and our offices too. We can phase out the rest of our burning of natural gas and fuel oil over the next 30 years and go to all electric technologies. Similarly with water heating, already about half of our water heaters use electricity. We can supplement those with developing heat pumps for water heating and phase out fossil fuels. So if we do that successfully, we are going to need a lot more electricity. So on the right hand of this graph, we see what would happen to electricity demand under this scenario. We currently use about 4,000 terawatt hours each year, and that would grow sharply over the next 30 years, not only for the direct use of electricity and the end uses I described, but there's a big green wedge here of electrolysis, of using electricity to create hydrogen. It's a very energy intensive process, but it creates a clean, carbon-free fuel. How can we produce all that electricity? Over on the left-hand side, we show where we are currently with generation in 2020. A good chunk of natural gas and coal still on there, a slab of orange here, which is our existing nuclear plants. But nearly all of these net zero modeling studies at the national level foresee a huge growth in renewables. Solar PV represented in the yellow, onshore wind in the light blue, and some offshore wind in this green here. So total generation could triple by 2050. Wind and solar could grow to perhaps a little more than 90% of total generation. But this study and nearly all studies indicate that that wind and solar, which is intermittent, needs to be complemented by clean, firm sources, controllable, non-intermittent sources like hydro, bioenergy, geothermal, nuclear power, or gas, ideally with carbon capture on it. And the good news in this modeling, as many of you know, is we have experienced a real revolution in renewable energy. The cost of wind and solar both dropped tremendously. This chart shows how over the last decade, the cost of wind energy has dropped a little more than 70%. We can now produce wind at $26 to $50 per megawatt hour. And that is a huge drop from 10 years ago. One key caveat when you look at these charts is that this measures what's called the levelized cost of energy or levelized cost of electricity. It's the average cost of a megawatt hour from a standalone wind plant, meaning just that wind plant, whatever it puts out under whatever time pattern, not as part of a system, not as part of a power system that keeps the lights on all the time. We see a similar story with solar photovoltaics. Solar costs have dropped about 90% over the last 10 years. And this is great news also. We can now produce solar at $30 to $41 a megawatt hour. Again, with that same caveat that this is a standalone solar plant. You get nothing at nighttime. You get plenty of energy during the day, but you have, of course, cloud effects and seasonal differences in how much that plant is putting out. But these two, the cost drops in these two technologies is fantastic news and is one of the big reasons why modelers believe we can achieve this net zero at a very low cost to the economy. Maybe if we do this smart, 1 or 2% of GDP by 2050. Not surprisingly, these wonderful cost trends on solar and wind lead some people to say, why don't we just go 100% renewable and forget about all those other sources, which often have, technical challenges of their own or political opposition. So we have lots of NGOs that have sprung up that have embraced the idea of 100% renewable electricity. And this is a key thing that, again, I want to emphasize. Mainstream analysts and modelers project that there is a big caveat we have to remember, that as a power system, an entire grid moves closer and closer to 100% solar and wind, at some point, the total system costs are going to increase sharply. I like to call this the riddle of cheap renewables versus potentially a high total system cost, and also reliability problems crawling in if we try to go all the way to 100%. Why is that? I'm going to try to, this is a little bit of a deep dive, but I want to try to see if I can give you a feel for this. This is a study that sort of looks at an illustrative power system with increasing levels of wind, solar, and storage. You have the total system, LCOE, over here on the left bar, and you have a system that grows from 0% renewables all the way to 100%. And this study also throws in some batteries, some lithium batteries, which have also dropped in cost a lot. And it shows that costs at the system level stay pretty steady out to 50, 60, 70%, but at some point they go exponentially up. You hit an elbow. Exactly where that elbow happens is going to depend on the particular grid you're working on and the mix of things. But why do most analysts expect this to happen? And the reason is because of the intermittency of solar and wind. There's something called integration costs, keeping the lights on, integrating these solar and wind sources. And those integration costs take several forms. As you get closer to 100%, you're going to have to build a lot more transmission to create more of a geographic averaging of your solar and wind over larger and larger areas. Number two, you're going to have to shift load away from times when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining to periods of risk generation. And that load shifting, and what's sometimes called demand response, is not free. Third, to deal with the intermittency, you're going to have to pay for storage. On a daily basis, when the sun doesn't shine, seasonal changes in wind and solar output, and just strange weather fluctuation that can cause wind and solar output to drop, sometimes compensated by my fourth category here called overgeneration. If you have to build more solar panels in the winter because in the winter the sun doesn't shine as long and the angle is worse just from a geophysical point of view, you're going to have a lot more generation in the summer if you just try to meet your winter target. All these involve spreading very large capital costs over infrequent but challenging periods of low renewable generation, and that's going to be costly. To illustrate this even further, I want to throw at you a wonderful word the Germans invented called Dunkelflaute. There are times when just randomly, but periodically, solar and wind generation drop very low for days and days on end. And what a system needs is a lot of backup generation just used during this time period to compensate for just these random fluctuations in solar and wind generation. That can be expensive if you're really close to 100% renewables. So I also want to acknowledge there is dissenting views on this. A few modelers will run pathways that rule out options of clean firm power like nuclear or gas with carbon capture. They create and advocate for 100% renewable pathways. Typically, these include massive expansions of transmission systems, massive amounts of battery storage, or even thermal energy storage, load shifting. They throw in some hydro and geothermal and burn hydrogen in turbines. Those may be technically feasible, but reliability and cost issues come in. I'll leave this topic by giving the last word to some authors from our National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL. In a journal article they published just last year, and 16 of them put their name to this. They concluded that significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% renewables at a national scale for all hours of the year. There is no simple answer to how far we can increase renewable penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. And they also say that reducing costs of low carbon generation electric sector, potentially by keeping non-renewable options available, like CCS and nuclear, this enables the electrifying and decarbonizing of other sectors. In other words, even some of our best experts at NREL are saying, don't bet all your chips on renewables supplying 100% of our electricity. So let me turn to the other big strategy for which there's varying views, but I'm going to present first kind of the mainstream modeling view and the mainstream IPCC view. As I said earlier, as we talked about this graph before, we're going to have to dramatically reduce emissions over the next 30 years. And that will include very likely some carbon capture technology on various industry sources, and perhaps some in the power sector as well. But just as important, we are going to have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And carbon capture technologies are going to be very likely to be needed to get into this net negative emissions zone in either a small way, couple billion tons a year, or potentially 5, 10, even up to 20 billion tons a year. A massive undertaking. The more we overshoot, the slower we move in the next 30 years, the more we're leaving a bigger and more challenging and expensive job of taking that CO2 out of the atmosphere later. So we need to move fast. So we need to do a little bit of this instead of a lot of this. How can we remove CO2 from the atmosphere once it's up there? This graphic sort of lays out the range of things that we can conceive of right now. And I first want to talk about what's called the nature-based approaches to this. As everyone knows, trees remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We can plant a lot more trees. We can reclaim damaged lands, and we can pull CO2 out of the air by increasing forestry, literally forestry biomass. We can also change farming practices that store more soil in underground and keep it out of the atmosphere, literally pull it out of the atmosphere. And these are great, and they have lots of good co-benefits for the environment as well. But there are physical limits to what we can do on nature-based just because of the land use requirements and the competition for producing food. And also, we have to realize that forests sometimes burn. They are not necessarily a permanent source of CO2 storage. And with drought and wildfires, as you all, particularly in California, know better than anyone, we can also lose this stored carbon all too easily. So that leads us to also want to develop technology-based approaches. We, at the pilot scale, we now know how to do direct air capture, literally processing large volumes of air through machines and using chemical means to remove the CO2, and we can pump it underground in safe geologic formations. That's called DACs. BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture, is a related strategy, again, being used at a pilot level where you grow dedicated crops that pull CO2 out of the air, then you burn them as a power source, but capture the emissions and store it underground. You literally are on a net basis pulling CO2 out of the air. There are also some potential for utilization of CO2 that could be embedded in various products. This will probably be a niche form of carbon capture and storage. The potential is not that huge. We're also working on some other things that could do this in the lab. There is a dissenting view on the need for this and whether we should be doing it at all. I've pasted a couple of headlines from some environmental groups here. A white paper by the Center for International Environmental Law last year said carbon capture doesn't work. It's too expensive. It's too risky. And most importantly, they make sort of a moral hazard argument that if we invest in this, we'll just prolong our dependence on fossil fuels. And so, although a number of major environmental groups are completely okay with the idea of carbon capture in various forms, there are some parts of the environmental community that write letters to all of our leaders saying we just have to end this. We should not develop this at all. Again, I respectfully disagree. I think it's a tool that we have to have in the toolbox. Which brings me to that Las Vegas metaphor. When we're betting on climate solutions, do we place all of our chips on renewables, or do we spread our chips on a broader portfolio? Now, if we ask ourselves, are the risks of nuclear power completely unacceptable? Should we leave all fossil fuels in the ground and never burn any with carbon capture? Should the idea of technological CO2 removal be off the table? If you buy into this, then implicitly you're putting all your chips on solving our climate problem on wind and solar largely, and on natural means of carbon removal, the forests and the soils. That might work. I can't sit here and say that's impossible, but the world might unfold in very different ways too. And I believe that we're going to need a broader portfolio of technologies. So to sum up, 4 strategies: be extremely efficient in all of energy use, electrify everything, double or triple electricity generation over the next 30 years, convert it all to zero carbon sources, commercialize fully carbon capture technology. We're going to need it for industry. We're going to need it for CO2 removal, very likely. And ultimately, spread our chips. Don't bet our climate just on one single narrow pathway. So I want to really commend the Rotary Climate Action Team Network for the work you're doing, and that you aspire to do more. I really hope that WRRI and some of my sister NGOs can help you turn ideas into action. As John said at the outset, you have options and opportunities to shape policy at the federal, state, and local levels. You can reduce the carbon footprints of your own business, organization, or household. And the subject of an entire different lecture would be increasing the resilience of your communities to extreme weather events that, as you know, are already beginning to increase. So again, thanks very much for this chance to speak with you today. Very happy to take questions. John, are you going to sort of MC the questions, or do you want me to look at the chat?
Terry and I will MC it for you. Thank you very much. This is wonderfully broad view of what it is that we need to address. I have a particular concern, and that has to do with nuclear. So since I'm involved in setting up who gets to ask questions, I'd love to ask that question. Where do you stand as far as your observation about where nuclear is going right now and where it's going to be over the next number of years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a couple of separable issues. One is we have a fleet of existing nuclear plants that generate 19 or 20% of our total electricity and close to 40 or 50% of our current carbon-free electricity. Some people would advocate shutting those down fairly quickly. Some of them are becoming more costly in their old age. And California is about to do a big experiment of shutting down Diablo Canyon and trying to backfill it with renewables, but also more natural gas. I think there's a strong case can be made that if a nuclear plant has a safe operational record, it makes sense to continue to run it, because if we shut it down, CO2 emissions are going to go up. Second question is, should we be developing a new generation of advanced nuclear plants? There are a number of designs being developed. There are a number of them that are going before the NRC for licensing. And Personally, I think we should see if some of these can turn out to be viable, safe, and economic sources. They run pretty much nonstop. Some of them can actually ramp up and down. And in either case, they present a clean, zero carbon source to complement the wind and solar, which fluctuates a lot.
Great, thank you. And put your virtual hand up if you have got a question. Joey O'Brien, you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. I'd like your opinion on companies like Ever. And if you're not familiar with it, they've developed a non-parasitic load thermal siphon system for deep geothermal. They built one test plant. They're building a bunch now in Europe because the cost of energy is so high there that they have a decent ROI. They've been funded by 40 million by BP to get them going. Is that one of the solutions, and how quickly could we ramp that one up, because it's dispatchable power?
Yeah, I think I mentioned geothermal very briefly in my presentation. First of all, I'm not an expert in geothermal, and I don't know exactly where different companies are in bringing this to full commercialization. However, we already have zero carbon geothermal plants in some areas of the world. California, of course, has a small fleet. And my understanding is that a number of companies, probably including the one you mentioned, are developing advanced geothermal drilling techniques and generation techniques that will let us do this in a much broader array of geographic areas. And that would be a very welcome source, again, of clean, firm power that could complement what is very likely to be a heavy solar and wind system in the future. So geothermal is one of those. It's part of that diverse portfolio. We should definitely be putting some of our chips on that technology.
Great. Philip Barnhart.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments about nuclear. I don't know if you're familiar with Nucor, the company that came out of Oregon State University and that is ready now to start building. I think they have a plant under development in Idaho. Any thoughts about that kind of technology? This is the one that you can build the thing in a factory, you put it on a rail car, you drop it in a deep pool vertically, and then it just runs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, advanced nuclear designs seem to take are on two basic paths. One is just improving the large reactors that we have historically built and putting in safer designs that don't require the kind of diesel backup pumps to pump in the cooling water, et cetera. The second path is small modular reactors, which is the Nucor design, where you might sacrifice some economies of scale by building something smaller, but you can get lower costs by really churning out major pieces in a factory instead of building everything or customized on site. And again, the small modular reactors have sort of radical redesigns to make them more inherently safe. And I think these hold a lot of promise, and a number of countries are moving forward with commercialization efforts in that zone.
Just a point of fact that I read in an article, that they're thinking they're not going to be able to have anything broadly available in those small modular designs until the early 30s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because it's sort of we have to hold two ideas in our head at once. We can and should be building solar and wind out dramatically this decade, because we have made it cheap. How did we make it cheap? It goes way back to the 70s and 80s, and the 90s, and the experiment and the work of NREL, and then finally the large-scale commercial manufacturing of wind turbines and solar cells that began in the 2000s and really took off in 2010. That's why we have cheap solar and wind now. We can probably get to a similar place by the early 2030s with small nuclear reactors and with carbon capture technology, but we can't put it on hold and then say, gosh, in 2030, it'd really be nice to have some more clean, firm options. We need to do the RD&D. If it doesn't pan out, fine. Or if only 2 of 4 options pan out, fine. But we will need that clean, firm power in the 2030s and beyond.
Wonderful. Tom Cochterman.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for such a well-balanced presentation. Much appreciated. I'd like to maybe shift the discussion a little bit back to a comment you made on the commercialization of captured carbon. And I'm wondering if you could clear that up for me. You know, it seems like there is already a fair amount of use of carbon and carbon fiber products. For example, I think Boeing, most of their, a lot of their aircraft wings and other parts of the planes are use carbon fiber. Is that a different kind of carbon that we're talking about? And just generally speaking, why do you consider it to be a niche part of the solution here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see, a couple things. First, your comment is spot on in terms of existing use of CO2. As you mentioned, we're already using carbon in some manufacturing processes. The other thing that many of you may be aware of is for more than 3 decades, 4 decades, the oil and gas industry has used CO2 as one means of enhanced oil recovery. Interestingly, they don't typically take CO2 that's combusted somewhere and stick it to the ground to produce more oil. There are actually natural mining of CO2 that will take place in one part of the country. They'll build a pipeline, ship it to Texas, pump it in, and it's economical to get more oil out. So in a sense, pieces of this puzzle are already proven. We know that we can ship CO2 by pipeline. We know that we can store it in geologic formations safely. What we have to start doing is capturing the CO2 after it's burned, or even there's potential for there's oxy-combustion methods too. And so instead of it going into the atmosphere, stick it in those safe geologic formations. The reason I talked about niche uses of utilization is, and I don't think I don't have the numbers right at my fingertips, but when people look at sort of the full range of carbon that needs to be captured, either from power or industry or literally pulling out of the atmosphere, they feel that the experts feel that there'll be sort of a natural limit of how much you can use to produce products before it's kind of just those options are exhausted. But again, that could change with the proper inventions. We'll see lots of changes over the next 30 years.
Yeah, if
Great.
I may just follow up, we've put a lot of things into what we used to call landfills. And now I think in some cases we're digging some of that stuff back up thinking, why didn't we save that earlier on? So we may be in a cyclical kind of argument here. I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Don Hausker.
Yes, thank you. It was a great presentation, and I think we do need to have multiple chips on the table. I am concerned though because, and I appreciate your technologist sort of point of view. I have one as well. I started technology companies in Silicon Valley, invested in others, so I know technology and I love technology. Yet, as I look at the challenges that we have, it really seems to me, with nature having demonstrated to us how it can sequester carbon at large scale through the natural processes, we're really not, putting enough chips on that option. In terms of getting regenerative agriculture used more broadly, and instead of crop subsidies that go to making agriculture a net carbon emitter, we could have it be a net carbon sink. What do you see as, and have you seen any good estimates of what that potential is if we could harness what nature already does in a more effective way?
Yeah. I would urge you to, you can go back to the 2018 IPCC report, and also hopefully by March, as early as March, I hope to see the updated Work Group 3 mitigation report, which will have again, a similar set of pathways as I put up on the screen. And what they said in 2018 is that there's just a physical maximum. We can max out soil sequestration and forest sequestration, and it gets us less than 10 billion tons a year. I think it's, you could get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, depending on, whether you have sort of like full compliance across all sorts of, sustainably managed forests and agriculture worldwide. There's just a physical limit to how much nature can take back. And that's why, again, sort of mainstream analysts say we will very likely need more than that. We will probably overshoot, and we will need to take out more than what nature can do, even at its maximum.
Okay, I'm going to keep on moving because I want everybody to get a chance. Jack Higgins.
Hi, thank you. That was a terrific talk, Karl. Regarding nuclear power, the rap against nuclear has always been safety and hazardous waste. And it's only been very recently that I've heard much from people I respect suggesting that safety is something that can be improved to the point it's worth considering continuing nuclear. What about the hazardous waste side of that? Are you optimistic that that could be solved within the next decade as well?
Yeah, it has always been, I think, an Achilles heel, so to speak. And yes, nuclear power produces a very long-lived waste. I think it can be managed with acceptable risk, not zero risk. And like with so many things, we have to trade off. Can we keep the management of nuclear waste to a small acceptable risk level in very deep, secure geologic formations? And is that risk worth accepting for producing a very steady, reliable stream of carbon-free nuclear power? My thing, I was like an anti-nuclear protester in my 20s. As the climate crisis came into focus in the 80s and has solidified, personally, I think the risks of climate change are so overwhelming that I personally am willing to accept what I think are small manageable risks of handling nuclear waste. And also there's risks with nuclear proliferation. And we need to stay on top of that as well. No energy source is risk-free. And I think we need to, again, climate crisis is, to me, existential.
Okay, Andres Vera, nice to see you.
Nice to see you also, John. Really a wonderful talk, Karl. Thank you so much. My question has to do with the financial implications of subsidies and what that means for the future. Obviously, it seems that subsidies have really brought us, the government subsidizing oil and meat consumption has really brought us to where we are right now. So I'm wondering if you know of any sort of tools or financial organizations that make it possible for people like us to really guide our investments, our personal investments. I believe that our pockets are really our money is powerful, and if we decide where we're going to invest our money, we can make more change. Short of giving advice of where to do investing, do you know anyone that can specifically, their investment theme is to make the world, the environment cleaner and solve climate change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not an expert on this at all. And if I had investment advice, of course, I couldn't give it anyway. But I have to punt on that one. I do believe there's obviously socially responsible mutual funds that lean in the direction you're talking about. There are also, I think, there are also more specialized investment funds dedicated to developing solutions. So I have to just put that back on your shoulders. I don't have much good information.
Okay. I'm going to put up a poll while we go to Bruce. You have a question?
I do, yes. Thank you. We had a very interesting program this past Tuesday at our Rotary Club. It was presented by a professor that spent 4 decades in both poles, analyzing ice cores and measuring CO2 and levels. And he presented a really interesting graph that went back millions of years of times that the Earth was warmer and different cycles when the Earth was colder. So it got me thinking when you mentioned that the goal would be nice to get below net zero. And I was wondering if there are any models predicting what happens when we do get below net zero. Is that something that is out, people are studying that? What does that do to the whole cycle of heating and cooling?
Yeah, of course, a goal of net zero or an annual emission that's either positive CO2 or negative CO2 is a flow, not a stock. And of course, flow does not influence temperature. It is the stock of greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere that will change climate. So, so first of all, of course, in any 1 year is just a small addition or subtraction to the concentration. And what the modeling that the Ipcc summarizes so well indicates is that we are going to continue to warm and perhaps even reach tipping points on our current trajectories. So if we are successful in getting to net zero by 2050, or how about negative 1 billion tons by 2050, that will just be the first turn of a rudder on a giant aircraft carrier that will try to take us back from the runaway warming to 2.5, 3 degrees. I hope that addresses what you're getting at.
Thank you.
That's lifestyle. We need to address our lifestyle. Sean Gold.
Thank you very much, John and Karl. Really appreciate your presentation. I like the spreading out our chips so that we balance our risk. In that, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on a carbon tax. I didn't hear any comments on that. I want to know if we're going to work with the oil industry is going to still be out there. There's going to be still energy production in our spreading out of our chips. What about a carbon tax to offset that?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on the fact that I talked, my 30 minutes was almost purely on the technological pathways and an argument to spread our chips, but also an assurance that we can do this. This is within reach. It's not time to be despondent. I also indicated that the total cost of the economy should be very manageable and a handful of percent of GDP easy. But the policy levers to do what I described is a whole nother set of vexing questions. Almost every sort of policy wonk and economist will say one of the best things we could do is to use a carbon tax, or alternatively a cap and trade system like California has and the EU has, to start to put the economic signals in place for all these transformations. Most people also think you probably, even in an ideal world, you'd want to complement a price on carbon with intelligent regulations, intelligent government and corporate procurement policies, a series of taxes and subsidies, perhaps to goose particular technologies. So that's a sort of a whole nother set of issues. Sadly, it appears that meaningful carbon taxes or strong cap and trade continuously runs into political problems. You know, California has one in place. It's actually starting to bite a little bit, and the trading price is going up. Washington State rejected a carbon tax. You can point to different situations in different countries. Reflects a little bit on the political culture, but yeah, that's it's the carbon tax is completely supported by the wonk community, and yet political support is touch and go.
Okay, Terry, my partner.
Thanks, John. I've been monitoring the chat box and just wanted to include some of the questions that showed up there. There are a number of people always, Karl, concerned about lithium battery and storage and the possible technology innovations in the area of storage. Can we sustainably continue to, mine lithium, and where do you see that storage challenge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for raising that. So first of all, I did not inflict yet another slide on you after the wind and solar one that showed how lithium battery costs have been plummeting over the last 10 years, which is also good news, which also is a means of integrating and firming up intermittent wind and solar. It's great. However, lithium prices have recently been firming up. We probably are not running into any kind of literally running out of lithium in the world, and there's going to be smaller and smaller concentration mines that we can probably turn to. But again, there's no free lunch. There's no part of this climate puzzle that doesn't have some environmental impact. So we need to be careful what we do, how we mine lithium, and make sure that we're not destroying the environment, displacing indigenous people, or leaving terrible toxic legacies. Again, not an expert on lithium mining and twists and turns, but it deserves attention. No matter what we do, with various rare earth metals, or whether we need a ton more aluminum and steel to build wind turbines, or what we do for solar panels, we need to look hard at being able to mine sustainably and as with low an impact as possible.
Okay, if I might just go on a minute, John, there was another
Absolutely.
question that's here in California that's relevant, in that we have kind of got this policy battle going on with regards to solar. Are you familiar with that?
Which one? There's a couple.
Okay, well, it has to do with the fact that the Public Utilities Commission here, the CPUC, is considering what many declare would be an unfair monthly charge to solar customers. Mm-hmm. And I guess the rationale from where I see is to help fairly pay the cost of our grid. And so that people who generate solar, are kind of getting a free lunch, and the people who have to pay for electricity are bearing the cost of all of our transmission infrastructure. So there's a proposal to levy a monthly charge on people who have solar. So I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, but here in California, yeah, that's kind of a big deal. So when you're trying to promote the idea of distributed rooftop solar, and you've got this proposal, a lot of people feel it might significantly impact how much solar is actually being done, at least in the residential markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an issue that's popping up all around the country. It's popping up globally too. If I put solar panels on my house and cut my electricity bill from $100 a month to $50 a month, that's great for me. But part of the $50 savings for me is not just saving the utility generating electricity. As you pointed out, Terry, that $50 that I save that the utility no longer gets is also covering utilities' various fixed costs for transmission, for distribution, for all the other grid support costs that are real. And when I cut my bill I am still benefiting from all the costs the utility incurs to maintain a reliable grid that I still tap into every night when the sun goes down, or when it's a week of cloudy generation and I don't get to use my solar very much. So the issue is real. The question is, what is a fair allocation of costs? How much should a solar owner continue to contribute to the fixed costs, unless that owner wants to completely unplug from the grid and not benefit from the grid reliability? So the issue is real. If we want to just spur more solar roofs, regardless of this, then we need to, as a society, say we are going to subsidize those homeowners. We're going to give the utility some extra dollars as their revenue goes down from solar, because we got to keep the grid going. So real issue, very gnarly question of what's the right amount of monthly charge for a solar user.
Okay, well, I'll go back to raising questions. The one last thing I wanted to ask you is, some people, there's been a request to potentially put your contact information in the chat. Would you
absolutely
be amenable to that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll put Carl's email address.
I'll also make my slides available to RCAT. You can post those. They have lots of web links. Any of you that want to do a deeper dive on some of these issues, I've tried to give a generous sprinkling of web links, and you'll also have my email.
Thank you.
And happy to do this kind of webinar. I do it a lot to NGOs, academics, universities, companies, governments. That's part of my prime directive.
Great. We're going to go on for a few more minutes. Steve, you had a comment, question.
You're muted, Steve.
You're muted.
Good. Hello. Wonderful presentation. I'm so impressed. I'm glad we're recording it so I can go back and watch it 2 or 3 times because it was so informative. And thank you for sharing the slides as well, because I will share them with our team. I had a question. We've been working on some big projects in Panama. One is a rotary reef, which we're making artificial reefs out of concrete. I've been studying there's what they call electronic trees or carbon. They say that they can put that into, they can store carbon into concrete and then bury it as part of carbon sequestration. I'm curious what you feel about that, and also would there be any toxins in that could be harmful to coral or the ocean? In other words, we don't want to think we're helping in one thing and hurt in another. Don't shoot the wolves in Yellowstone. We don't want to help one thing and hurt another. Do you have any comments or thoughts on
that? I just have a little bit of insight. Again, not an area of deep expertise for me. I am aware that there are methods of what they call producing green cement, green concrete that will literally sequester some CO2. There's a version of that being developed at the University of Michigan that actually they claim gives the concrete some added durability and even a little bit of flexibility that helps. So again, it's a promising area of research. It'd be great to see products fully commercialized.
Okay.
Whether that's variations of concrete like that could go into the ocean for artificial reefs. Is there leaching? Is there any downsides? Just beyond my expertise. Don't know.
Okay. Right now, we've just partnered with HP to help us do 3D printing reefs, and so that would be great if we could use that technology to, to basically cover both bases. So thank you so much. Very informative.
Yeah, I can't help just mentioning one thing. I'm, again, not my area of deep expertise, but so many things we can do in the ocean, so good. Replant mangrove forests, sequester carbon, modify storm surge, artificial reefs. If we can sequester some carbon in them, plus restore natural or man-made reefs, again, to help on storm surge, we have a whole adaptation and resilience question we have to be addressing, even as we also to get emissions down. I'm glad you're involved in that, Steve.
Yeah, we're also doing kelp, and we're doing
kelp. Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Kelp, reefs, trees, and mangroves all at the same time.
Thank you, Karl. Very much appreciated. This was a lively group, and I really do appreciate the time that you've taken and the focus you put on this. And I'm looking forward to an opportunity to work with you, for Terry and I to work with you on coming up with some additional opportunities to share expertise and knowledge with this group.
Thank you. Great questions, great comments. Look forward to working more with you.